As Iran and its proxies beat the war drums ever harder, and Israel prepares for a multi-front war in the new year of 2024, the Biden administration is escalating its pressure on Israel to stand down by, among other things, using its own proxies to threaten to overthrow the Netanyahu government. I'll give you details on all that coming up on In Focus. 2023 was not a very nice year here in Israel. In fact, it was a terrible year in Israel. It started with 10 months of the left's insurgency, near civil war against the Netanyahu government, and it ended in war with the Hamas October 7th invasion that, of course, opened up a major war between Israel and Hamas, and Israel with Iran's Lebanese proxy, Hezbollah, a war that right now is seen as low intensity, but it is moving very quickly towards high intensity, as we'll see in just a second. 2023 ended with Hamas shooting a 20-rocket barrage at central Israel to the areas around Tel Aviv at midnight to show that, just as we've seen, really, that despite the fact that the IDF has gained control on the ground of much of northern Gaza and also parts of central Gaza, and is focusing its effort on southern Gaza, the areas where Israel controls things on the ground doesn't mean that the war is over. We've had very violent battles, ambushes of our forces in the north and in central Gaza, because while you may control 70-80% of the terrain, you control far less of the subterranean battle space, which is where Hamas, of course, has burrowed down in a massive expanse of tunnels, some of which are miles long and located anywhere between 50 and 80 meters below the surface. And there we keep seeing over and over again Hamas terrorists jumping up like Viet Cong in the Vietnam War, killing IDF soldiers and then running back into their holes. And it's much more difficult as a practical matter to get them there, which is also where we assess that the hostages are located, being used as human shields around Hamas's terror masters, both throughout the Gaza Strip. I certainly don't know whether it's in northern or central or southern Gaza. In the south, IDF forces are focusing their efforts right now in the town of Khan Yunis, which is another major operational hub of Hamas. It's where their leader, Yahya Sinwar, mass murdering sadist jihadist, lives, and it is likely to now be located in the tunnels beneath the surface. And we have many brigades operating there. It's a very, very difficult battle space. The finding is house to house. It's very violent. It's very hard. And it's ongoing. The one place that Israel hasn't really attacked yet, but it must, as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said at his news conference on Saturday night, is the border town of Rafah, which controls the international border between Gaza and Egypt. And that's seen as the major strategic hub of weapons smuggling, again, through subterranean tunnels and also through humanitarian assistance trucks moving in from Gaza from Egypt to Gaza. So we're looking at a very difficult battle that we're fighting today, and an expanded battle that we're going to be fighting in the future throughout the Golan Heights. I keep saying Golan Heights because we're going to get to that in a second, throughout the Gaza Strip. So this isn't a nice way to start the year. I was doing an interview Saturday night with Fox's online Live Now news, and it was nice. It was a long interview, and the interviewer asked me what I thought the greatest threat facing Israel was going to be in 2024, and I said, take a number, because there are so many. And I said 2024 is going to be a war year. It'll be a year of war. And as we see, it certainly is starting out that way. And there's every reason to believe that it's only going to escalate in the coming months. So unfortunately, that's the news. But hopefully by this time next year, on January 1st, 2025, the war will be behind us and our enemies will have been defeated and our soldiers will have been able to come home to their families. Be that as it may, we are seeing the other fronts rising in intensity of the fighting and of the organization of enemy forces, all organized by Iran, of course, to expand and escalate their fight against Israel. In Lebanon, we see a couple of things. One is that we're continuing to see escalating rocket fire into northern Israel, and we're also seeing depressingly or distressingly that there's also been a pretty heavy movement of forces from eastern Syria and Iraq and perhaps from Afghanistan through these areas into Lebanon. So we've been seeing increasing troop movement and movement of armaments from the Iraq border across Syria and into Lebanon, or in terms of the forces, they're moving into Lebanon and they're moving into the Syrian Golan Heights perched against Israel's northeastern border in the Golan Heights. So we're seeing Iran lining up its proxy forces for an extensive operation against Israel from the north, both in Syria and in Lebanon. The IDF, and particularly the Air Force, has been carrying out a lot of escalating strikes inside of Syria, both against the Damascus airport and against the rat line of forces and munitions that are being transported by land across Syria, starting in Iraq. I think over the weekend we saw air attacks that did extend from east in Iraq into the Syrian Golan Heights to try to block the movements of forces. And of course, Israel attacked the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps that was operating in Syria, of the Syrian division, I guess you would call it, of the IRGC, who was responsible for coordinating both the movement of forces and munitions in the war against Israel. So he was taken out, as were some other IRGC senior leaders operating in Syria over the past week. So they're lining up their forces, and Israel is doing what it can in order to undermine their ability to line up those forces ahead of a much more high-intensity battle in the north. And Israel has done a lot of training of its forces. We had forces that are now sort of being quietly would diminish the number of forces at the border with Lebanon. Reservists are being allowed to go home for a couple of weeks and then come back, so they're having more extended furloughs and then returning. They underwent training on the Merkava 3 tanks, which Israel was intending to idiotically export to Europe, but those orders were canceled and they've been reintroduced to IDF service for our reservists that are poised to fight in Lebanon. So we've had that. We're building up new division forces that'll be able to fight in the northern sector as well, and going over war plans. So we're looking towards that. We have the Houthis in the Red Sea. The United States is removing now, just gave orders, Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, to withdraw the USS carrier group Gerald Ford back to its home port in Virginia from the eastern Mediterranean, where it was deployed immediately after Hamas's October 7th invasion. And now Austin said that it's going back to the United States. So they're removing that, which we'll get to in a second. But the United States' Eisenhower carrier group is in the Gulf of Aden off the Yemenite coast with the Bab el-Mandab as part of this coalition that the United States formed to try to fight the Houthi piracy of international shipping in the Red Sea. But so far, that coalition seems to be a bit of a dud. It seems to, again, just be an Anglo-American force of the British and the Americans, and they've made pretty explicit their intention not to take any offensive action against the Houthis. But, you know, there's a lot of fog of war in that fight. So on the surface, it looks completely incompetent, but they are bringing a lot of naval vessels there, both the British and the Americans. So that remains a work in progress, and we'll have to see what the Americans are really intending to do, because right now, basically, they're standing back and allowing Iran to undermine international merchant shipping in one of the major hubs of world commercial markets. So that would be quite extraordinary if the United States decides they don't care about that anymore. So we'll just have to see how that pans out. But all the same, the Houthi operation in the Red Sea to interfere with civilian shipping has already led to an effective maritime embargo or blockade of Israel's port in Eilat. So Israel is suffering very significant consequences to this act of economic war, of naval war by the Houthis, and the United States has been restraining Israel from taking any offensive action against Yemeni ports and Houthi forces, or the Iranian, most importantly, the Iranian espionage ship that we've spoken about in previous discussions, that's really directing all of the Houthi operations against international shipping in the Red Sea. So the United States is restraining Israel. It so far has limited all of its operations to defensive interceptions of bombs, of drones being shot at civilian merchant vessels in the Red Sea by the Houthi forces that are being directed by Iran. So the United States, we'll have to see. That's a work in progress, but certainly they don't seem to be doing a lot. And then finally, there was word that just came out, a report today, that Central Command in the IDF is now assessing in its assessment for 2025 that we face an increased likelihood of assaults from Jordan by Iranian controlled militias, Hezbollah and others, attacking Israel from Jordan. We know that there have been a lot of fights between Jordanian military forces and these Iranian controlled militia from Hezbollah and other terror groups controlled by Iran in Iraq and in Syria, both along the Jordanian border with Iraq and Jordan's border with Syria. Just over the past couple of weeks, we've seen over the past 2 years an intense smuggling operation across the border between Israel and Jordan of arms and terrorists, both into Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and also into sovereign Israel. And that those massive smuggling operations led to the intensification of Palestinian terrorist attacks against Israel over the past 2 years in Judea and Samaria and in places like Jerusalem. There seems to have been a linkage formed between these Iranian proxy forces in Iraq and Syria operating through Jordan and into Israel. So Central Command is concerned that we may actually be seeing war scenarios carried out along the border with Jordan by Iranian proxies. So that's a border that's been largely unprotected. We discussed this also in terms of the reduction of reserve forces that Israel carried out in the past 2 decades that has seen our reserve forces on the eve of the Hamas October 7th invasion having been reduced over 80% over a 20-year period. So now we're expanding them, obviously. All the same, this is the threat environment. So when I said take a number to Fox, I meant it. Then let's just go back for a second to the removal of the carrier group and the larger game that the United States, the Biden administration, is now carrying out in terms of its relations with Israel and with Iran. Oh, and Iran, one last word about that. I think we've spoken about it, but if not, it's worth just mentioning, and it's worth mentioning even if we have, which is that Iran, the International Atomic Energy Agency of the UN, which is in charge of inspecting all of Iran's nuclear sites and overseeing in general its illicit nuclear weapons program, announced that Iran has massively expanded its 60% enrichment operations, which it pledged not to do just months ago, and it's now essentially placed no limits on the amount of uranium it's enriching to near weapons-grade levels. And the assessment of a lot of people whose opinions I trust have said, look, it looks like what Iran is trying to do is reach nuclear breakout, not with one atomic bomb, but actually being able to announce at once that it has an atomic arsenal of 10 or 20 atomic bombs, so that it's not saying we have one nuclear pop gun, take us seriously. It's saying we have 20, take us very seriously. And so that seems to be the operation, that they want a cascade effect where they have a full-fledged nuclear arsenal when they reach breakout pace and reach breakout mode. And the large assessment, the basic assessment of Israeli war planners is that Iran intends to attack Israel through Hezbollah and perhaps directly as soon as it reaches nuclear breakout. So that they're restraining for now Hezbollah because they want Hezbollah to attack Israel with full force, along with the augmented forces that they're bringing in to Syria from Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. They want Hezbollah to attack basically simultaneous with Iran declaring that it has a nuclear arsenal. So this then brings us to the United States' decision to withdraw the Ford carrier group from the Eastern Mediterranean. So the decision by President Biden's decision, just like on October 8th, to deploy the carrier group to the Eastern Mediterranean seemed to have been made kind of on the fly. And initially, it was incredibly important for Israel because we were facing we were facing a devastating scenario that while we were still gathering our forces after the complete shock that we received on October 7th with Hamas's invasion and the slaughter of 1,200 Israelis in a single day and the kidnapping of another 240 into captivity as hostages of Hamas in Gaza, we needed time to catch our breath and to mobilize our reserve forces both in Gaza and also in the north, because Hezbollah immediately opened up with barrages of rocket and missile fire into Israel following Hamas's invasion. So if the United States hadn't announced that it was sending the carrier group and then sent it, Israel was facing a prospect of being at war with Hezbollah without having the forces to fight that war. So it was an extremely important move by Biden that may have stopped a Hezbollah invasion. So what are we supposed to do now? And we're looking at this as Iran has Hezbollah and also Hamas forces are entering into South Lebanon. They already have a presence there in greater numbers. They're coming in now. How are we supposed to look at the Biden administration's decision to remove the Ford carrier group now when chances of war rise by the day? So there are three different ways to look at it. One is just, it's got nothing to do with anything, which is what Secretary Austin said. He said, look, we sent it there, but it was supposed to be in dock in Virginia for servicing, and we're bringing it back now so that it can remain on its servicing schedule, and it's got nothing to do with anything and nothing to see here. Folks, maybe, probably not. There are two other possible scenarios that I see just off the top of my head. The first one is, look, I said the entire time, like after that initial save that the United States did so importantly on the heels of October 7th by sending the carrier group to the Eastern Mediterranean, it became less and less clear who the carrier group was there in order to deter from going to war, whether it was Hezbollah as originally advertised or whether it had just become Israel. Because in the meantime, Biden kept sending more and more messages to Israel. Some of them have been published in the U.S. media itself saying, you better not go to war against Hezbollah. You better not go to war against Hezbollah. We have 70 or 80,000 Israelis who are now internal refugees from the border communities with the north because they can't live there given the level of threat posed by Hezbollah forces, commando forces perched at the border and trained to invade their communities and massacre them. So we have 70,000 at least internal refugees from the border communities in the north who are now living in hotels throughout the country because they can't live in their homes until that threat from Hezbollah forces and obviously Hezbollah missiles and rockets is diminished. So that's one thing that we're facing. Another thing that we're facing, and so as a result of that particular threat, we're in a situation where unless something miraculous happens and Hezbollah decides to stand down. And even if that happens, Hezbollah still has to remove its forces from the border. We can't allow our civilians to go back. The threat is just too great after what happened on October 7th. You can't have an armed terrorist force controlled by Iran standing at your border right against the walls, right in front of the homes of your civilians. You can't do that anymore. So Israel can't actually allow its civilians to go home to their farms and to their homes until after the Hezbollah forces are removed. The likelihood of reaching some sort of diplomatic solution to this clearly military problem are basically nil. And yet the United States was trying to negotiate a deal between Israel and Hezbollah that would see a cosmetic withdrawal of some of those forces, perhaps 10, perhaps 30 kilometers away from the border, but they would all remain intact. And in exchange, Israel is supposed to cough up its own sovereign territory from the Golan Heights to the city of Nahariya on the western coast to Hezbollah, which if Israel were stupid enough to do, would constitute a strategic collapse of Israel's will to defend itself and be seen as such by Iran and its proxy forces at our borders and also by our allies throughout the Arab world, or would-be partners all the same. And so you have that situation where the United States was pushing for a policy that was going to further imperil Israel. Not to fight means leaving northern communities at risk of annihilation by invading forces from Lebanon and trying to push them away in a diplomatic agreement that was going to see Israel surrender territory to the Iranian proxy as it threatens to invade Israel would also be a strategic calamity for the Jewish state. So Israel would also not be able to do with that. On the other hand, forcing Israel to stand down is a strategic victory for Hamas and for Hezbollah and for Iran for the same reason. So that's been the United States policy. And so the question was, what is the Ford Carrier Group doing in the region, given that the United States is forcing Israel to restrain itself against growing aggression from the north, from Hezbollah and from Iran's other proxies in Syria and in Iraq. And now it's leaving. So aside from what Austin claimed, which is that it's just going for repairs and regular servicing, there are two other scenarios. One is that the United States has said to Israel, do whatever you want. We're just not going to be involved. We're not, we don't want to be part of this war. We don't feel like fighting Iran and its proxies. If you feel you need to, go ahead, but we're not going to help you. And that's why we're removing our carrier group. The other possibility is that they're doing it in order to threaten Israel and say, look, you're on your own. Good luck to you. If you go against our wishes to war in Lebanon, then not only are you on your own, but, we're not necessarily going to side with you because we offered you this idea of strategic collapse through surrender of territory and you didn't want it. So, it could be bad or, it could be we're washing our hands of it, but you have a green light. Could be washing our hands of it and we're not supporting you. I mean, I think that those are the two most likely explanations for it. But what we definitely know is that what Biden wants most urgently is for the war to end. And to this end, not only have there been multiplying reports that he's been haranguing Netanyahu, that their conversations are no longer, friendly chats between two allies, with the larger ally, the United States, wanting to be in communications with a smaller ally to see how to help them as a smaller ally fights the forces that are also enemies of the larger ally, the United States, but rather that these are increasingly hostile conversations where Biden is doing two things. One is demanding that Israel stand down, both in relation to the Houthis and Iran and its nuclear arsenal, and not to attack Iran and its nuclear installations or its refineries or its oil terminals and gas terminals on the coastline, and not to attack preemptively Hezbollah in Lebanon or take any action that may move the front in the north into a more high-intensity mode along the lines of what we're seeing in Gaza. And as for Gaza, the United States wants Israel to set out its plan for the day after. And the United States insists that the plan for the day after, that it insists that Israel sit down and discuss and approve, would involve moving Palestinian Authority, U.S.-trained anti-Israel military forces from Judea and Samaria to Gaza, and they would then take over Gaza in a post-Hamas Gaza, not Israel, and then that would lead to the unification of Judea and Samaria, the Palestinian Authority-controlled areas in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, and increased pressure to compel Israel to accept a Palestinian state ruled by Fatah, ruled by the PLO, ruled by the Palestinian Authority, controlled by Palestinian Authority forces in Judea and Samaria, in Gaza, and likely in Jerusalem as well. And Israel rejects that on many, many levels. It rejects it because the Palestinian Authority forces are terrorist forces, just like the ones in Hamas. They have a longer timeline for Israel's annihilation, but they have the same goal, which is Israel's annihilation. And even though they've been funded and trained and are massively supported by U.S. taxpayers and the U.S. military, they are corrupt, largely incompetent, but they're also genocidal in their outlook towards Israel. These forces train to kill Israelis. They train to invade Israeli communities. We have, training videos of these U.S.-trained forces, or you can look at some where they are training to invade Israeli communities, to attack Israeli forces in Judea and Samaria and seemingly beyond as well. So that's one reason. They're enemy forces, despite the fact that they are trained by the United States. Basically, the United States has raised an enemy terrorist army in Israel's heartland and insists that it's an ally to Israel in the war against terror. And of course, in the joint war of the moderate Palestinians from the PLO and the moderate Israelis from the hard left against the extremists on both sides, with Hamas being the extremists in Palestinian society and the evil settlers, Jews, the 500,000 Jews who live in Judea and Samaria on the Israeli side. So it's all sort of this package, this concept, which was completely proven wrong on October 7th. It had been proven wrong a million times before, but in the most graphic and horrific way on October 7th, when all factions of Palestinian society participated in the invasion and the massacre and the mutilation, the rape, the kidnapping, the looting of Israeli citizens and Israeli communities along the border. And Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, the PA security services have done nothing but celebrate October 7th since. So there's like no daylight between Hamas and Fatah. And as for the violent settlers or whatever, this has been repeatedly demonstrated by Israel police, and grudgingly, as we discussed last week, by Central Command as well, that this is just a lie. There is no settler violence, violent altercations between Jews and Muslims, Jews and Palestinians in Judea and Samaria were down 50% month by month from 2022 in the 2 months that followed October 7th. So there is no escalating violence by Jews against Arabs in Judea and Samaria or anywhere else in the country. And so this is just, it's just a slanderous attack. At any rate, I think it's really important to point out that on December 28th, one of the administration's mouthpieces, Washington Post columnist David Ignatius, wrote a piece where he essentially laid out the U.S. Plan to compel Israel to accept its day after scenario by, among other things, threatening to oust or actually ousting Prime Minister Netanyahu from power. Because Netanyahu, despite all of this pressure that's being placed on him, both by the Americans and then by the left-wing members of his emergency war cabinet, Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, working, by the way, with Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who was supposed to be a loyalist to Netanyahu, but he's sort of reverted to type as an IDF general, and he's siding with the pacifists and the general staff against Netanyahu, and they're all insisting on having this discussion in the government, in the war cabinet, and the emergency cabinet, and wherever on the day after, where Israel has to accept the American plan, essentially, of a Palestinian state being the end state of the Palestinian invasion of Israel and the massacre of 1,200 Israelis, so that they invade us, they massacre us, they slaughter us, they rape us, and then we have to give them a state. That's the American plan. And in the meantime, Israel has to stand down in Lebanon, stand down, let Iran cross the nuclear threshold in Iran, allow the Houthis, Iran's proxies, to blockade its coastline. And so I just want to say a couple of things here. So Ignatius's article was notable for its incredible hostility towards Netanyahu, who we should just remember a year ago received a resounding mandate from the people of Israel to lead the country, and still today has the support now in time of war of 60% of Israelis who want him to continue on. And less than a third of Israelis think that he should resign. So, we're looking at majority, small minority. Unfortunately, this minority contains a lot of the same elites who were burning Israel down for the 10 months preceding the October 7th invasion. At any rate, so here's what he says, and I'm just going to read a bit of this. It's called Palestinians Must Be Part of Any Post-War Gaza Peacekeeping Force. So here he's making the deal. Now, what does he say? It's very nice the way that Ignatius puts everything together, all of the Israeli far-left talking points together with the Biden administration, because basically they're operating together. And so he says here, as New Year's Day approaches, this is from December 28th, in a blood-soaked Gaza, the Biden administration must prod Israel to face reality. There is no end game for this war that doesn't require a Palestinian security force to maintain order in Gaza after Hamas is deposed. Then he goes on and he starts talking about how it has to be the Palestinian security forces. It's true they're corrupt. It's true they're incompetent, but they're all we have, and we need them, and we need them to come in. And then he says that Prime Minister Netanyahu refuses, perhaps is incapable of thinking clearly about this, and that's why he's resisting. And he says, and this is one of the lovely things that he says. There's so many lovely lines here. It's hard not to just read the whole thing and gag, but I'll try my best. It says here, Israel's difficulty in thinking clearly about future security in Gaza is an example of the broader policy-making failure in Israel after the country went to war after Hamas's savage terrorist attack on October 7th. Some prominent Israelis have told me privately for more than a month that the United States must press Israel to make wise choices about this war because Netanyahu seems unable to make them himself. So our leader is incompetent, and therefore his political opponents in Israel, not surprisingly, are telling Ignatius privately that, the United States has to hector Israel and force Israel to take the actions that are weak and, listless prime minister seems unable to make himself. Then he goes like this. He says the only way to do Gaza right is to empower these forces in the West Bank. Against these forces are the ones training for war against Israel. These forces in Gaza participated and took pictures of themselves participating. And we showed you this before. Here it is again, Fatah forces, right, with their Fatah headbands on, going in and participating in the slaughter of Israelis on October 7th, right? So he's saying that these forces, 17,000 of them, are in Gaza and have been receiving monthly checks from the U.S. financed Palestinian authorities since Hamas took over Gaza in 2007. And they have to be the backbone of a future Palestinian security force. So these people are adjuncts to Hamas and have been since 2007. And now they're going to be on top of Hamas, and they're going to be moderate, and they're going to be independent of Hamas, and they're going to take over with Egypt's help, with America's help, and by shoving them down Israel's throat. But in order for that to happen, first of all, something else has to happen, which is that Israel has to give Palestinian security services, again, these people training to kill us in Judea and Samaria at the U.S. taxpayers' dime, we have to let them operate more widely in Judea and Samaria. So right now, under the treaties that Israel signed with the PLO, they're allowed to operate in Area A, which are all the Palestinian major cities in Judea and Samaria, from Jenin in the north to Hebron in the south. They go across and they operate only in the cities. They're extremely well-trained commandos. They have the latest military gear and armaments, courtesy, again, of U.S. taxpayers and U.S. trainers from the U.S. military and the CIA. So they have all of this training. They have all of these arms, but they're only allowed to operate in the cities. And America says that's no good. That's only 18% of the territory. And they have to be able to operate in what's called Area B, which is the sort of the smaller villages in Judea and Samaria, more rural areas of Judea and Samaria that abut the Israeli community, so that they can be an even larger threat to the 500,000 Israelis living in Judea and Samaria, and then the 2 million, 3 million Israelis who live in central Israel, which is just a stone's throw from Judea and Samaria. So what he's saying is, okay, they're only an 18%. Let's expand their writ. Let's allow them to operate openly in another 22%, so that they're actually in control of 40% of Judea and Samaria, and they're literally operating just outside of the communities where you have 500,000 Israelis living, and the cities where you have several more million Israelis living, because that's going to solve the situation in Gaza, where they're going to be deployed together with Hamas's adjunct crew in Fatah that have been getting all the money from U.S. taxpayers since 2007 and operating under Hamas, including on October 7th, and there's participation in the slaughter in southern Israel. So the United States has to allow that to happen. And the biggest roadblock to all that is who? I don't know how you got it, but you're right. It's Bibi. It's Prime Minister Netanyahu. He's the biggest problem. And he just has to be marginalized. So first, what he does, which is interesting, is that Ignatius praises to high heaven the general of Central Command. We've talked about him repeatedly here, Yehuda Fuchs. So just as I reviled him because he has attached himself to the American slander of Israelis who live in Judea and Samaria, and his incredible insistence on parroting the libelous claims that there's been an expansion of settler violence. We talked about this, I think, almost the entire broadcast last week. So just as I find him an object of scorn and believe that he should never have been appointed to his position, he should certainly be removed from his position as quickly as possible because of the way that he acts and his refusal to understand the inherent hostility of the Palestinian forces that the United States has trained in Judea and Samaria. So Ignatius and his interlocutors in the Biden administration and in Washington uphold him as a paragon of stability. So of Fuchs, he sees him as, quote, he is an unlikely ally to the United States in the drive to restrain extremist settlers. Of course, there aren't almost any of those, but the United States has capitalized on it because it enables them to maintain their faith and devotion to this insane and completely wrong idea that there's a moral parallel or moral equivalence between Israel and the Palestinians, and that Hamas is to the moderate Palestinians and Fatah who support Hamas what the settlers are, the messianic, the extremist settlers are to good, enlightened, left-wing Israelis. So who they now view Yehuda Fuchs as a paragon of. And so he talks about how he has a consistent record of attacking and condemning, libeling the Israelis who live in Judea and Samaria, and therefore he has to be supported. So this is what he says here. He says, and I'll just read the last two paragraphs because they're important. The Biden administration should recognize that senior IDF commanders oppose violence committed by extremist settlers and the harassment of the authorities, that's the Palestinian authorities, fragile security forces, because they make it harder to maintain order in the West Bank and eventually to create a stable post-Hamas order in Gaza in which Palestinian rights and security will be respected. The IDF doesn't want an endless war, as opposed to everybody else, I guess, in Israel who does. And then he goes on, this is his final paragraph, Netanyahu's relentless campaign against Hamas has shattered Gaza. He seems to have no idea how to put the pieces back together or even to care what happens to the Palestinians there. The United States has a plan for the day after, even if Netanyahu doesn't. He should start listening or face the likelihood that he will soon be replaced. Who's going to replace him? Fuchs? And here you have it. So this is Ignatius, and he talked also to Martin Indyk, one of the greatest haters of Israel in Washington, and he was telling him what to think. And then with the Israeli leftists who hate Netanyahu, said that the United States should, force Netanyahu to heal. And then he talks about this general who is working with the United States, and particularly Lieutenant General Mike Fensel, who's the security coordinator of Palestinian forces that operates out of the embassy in Jerusalem. Mike, by the way, Lieutenant General Fensel he went to graduate school with me at the Kennedy School at Harvard. I have nothing personal against him, but the fact that he was brigade commander in the 82nd Airborne Division in Afghanistan gives him zero credibility when it comes to issues related to Israel. We're not fighting 8,000 miles away from our homes. We're fighting in our homes, from our homes. We're being attacked in our homes. So there's no connection. And of course, the United States was defeated in Afghanistan. So all of these things probably speak to why a U.S. security coordinator doesn't have the vaguest idea of what Israel's interests are or how to protect them in Judea and Samaria, nor should he care because it's not his problem. At any rate, here I just want to say one last thing. The thing about all of these day after scenarios is that we're very much not at the day after. We're in the midst of a war for our survival. The most intense front right now is Gaza, and it's going to remain high intensity for some time, whether our IDF that wants no endless war likes it or not, because that's just the name of the game. I mean, there's nothing we can do about it. And of course, we're facing all of these other active and quickly intensifying fronts in the north, in the south with the Houthis, and even in the east with Jordan. And we're looking at this very, very difficult scenario. The United States pulls its aircraft carrier group out, sending an extremely mixed signal. But at the same time, it's letting everybody know that it is telling Israel, ordering Israel, barking at Israel through Netanyahu every single day, demanding that we stand down, that we restrain ourselves, that we lower the intensity of our operations in Gaza, even when we should probably be escalating the intensity of those operations and certainly laying siege to Gaza, something that the United States absolutely opposes because they want us to resupply Hamas all the time through this humanitarian aid corridor that Hamas controls completely. So all of this is the U.S. game plan. And here is Israel, and here is Ignatius calling for the overthrow of the Israeli government if we don't agree to be defeated in this war. I don't know what's going to happen, but I know that unlike the United States that doesn't want to pay attention to the war, Iran is dead serious about fighting it through its proxies and also directly through its expanded nuclear operations. Israel, I think that the more pressure and the more animosity they display towards Netanyahu, the longer he'll stay in power. He may end up retiring at the ripe old age of 140 at this rate, just because the Americans are making the Israelis constantly rally around them, even if we didn't want to. But be that as it may, we do live here. We're not security coordinators in somebody else's countries. We're the neighbors of the people who slaughtered us on October 7th, and neighbors of the people who want to continue assaulting and slaughtering us throughout the country today. So we're not going anywhere. This is our country. This is where we stand. These people are all enemies of the United States. But if America doesn't want to fight its battle, I guess the least that we could ask is that it not interfere with our ability to do so. Anyway, those are my thoughts going into the new year. As I said, like it or not, and none of us like it, 2024 is a year of war. And we have to fight it. We have no choice, and we have to win it. We have no choice. It's not about empowering Palestinians the day after. It's ensuring Israel's survival in perpetuity, whatever happens. Anyway, those are my thoughts, and we'll talk to you again next time.